Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Legislative Breakfast and Reporters Roundtable, hosted by the Georgia First Amendment Foundation and the Atlanta Press Club. I'm Ken Foskett, and president of the Georgia First Amendment Foundation. We are an all-volunteer organization made up of journalists, lawyers, and media professionals who safeguard the rights of Georgians to access public records and attend public meetings. So, if you believe in the public's right to know, join us. Become a member, volunteer, and support programs like this one. You can find us at gfaf.org. I know the Atlanta Press Club would love to have you as members too. You can find them at atlantapressclub.org. Let me now turn the program over to Sarah Brewerton Palmer, the co-chair of the Foundation's Legislative Committee and the moderator of our first panel on Gold Dome issues affecting your right to know. Take it away, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Ken. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 2023 Gold Dome event. My name is Sarah Brewerton Palmer. I'm a partner here at Kaplan Cobb in Atlanta, and I frequently handle cases involving the First Amendment and government transparency issues. And I'm also the chair of GFAF's Legislative Committee. So I'm paying a lot of attention to the legislature these days and excited about our conversation today. I'll be moderating the first panel of the morning, which will focus on issues relating to the Foundation's mission of advocating for government transparency, free speech rights, and access to public information, meetings, and proceedings. We at the Foundation could not carry out our mission without support from our sponsors. So at the top here, I just want to thank our major donors and our individual donors and our members for supporting our work all year long. And now I'm going to introduce our panelists for this first session. Senator Josh McLaurin represents North Fulton. He was elected to the Senate for the first time this past election, and he previously served in the State House of Representatives from 2019 through 2022. Chairwoman Lisa Cupid has led the Cobb County Commission since 2021, and before that served as a commissioner for 8 years. She's an attorney and a former mediator, a policy analyst, and a manufacturing process engineer. Jill Nolan is a reporter for the Georgia Recorder, covering the General Assembly. And over her 15-year career, she has covered state and local government across 4 states. Thanks to each of our panelists for joining us this morning to talk about government transparency and First Amendment issues that we're seeing across the state this year and coming up ahead in the legislative session. Yesterday, Governor Kemp addressed the legislature with his State of the State address, and I was thinking of starting our agenda today with some of the topics that he highlighted in his speech, but then I realized that we were already going to cover a whole lot of those in the outline I had planned. So instead, I thought we might start with an incident that took place at the Capitol after his speech and talk about the transparency and First Amendment issues that raises. In a press conference after Governor Kemp's speech, a legislator had a medical incident at the Capitol, and journalists who were there covering the speeches were asked to stop taking photos during the incident. Jill, you were there and present. Do you want to give us an overview of what happened? You probably have a more accurate perspective than me since I wasn't there. And can you talk to us about the impact that it has on journalists when they're told to not take pictures or to not do their job when they're in a public place, performing their duties?
Yeah, sure. Now I'll try to set the scene a little bit. It was, shortly after the governor's State of the State, as you said, the Democrats in the House and the Senate were holding a joint press conference to offer their response. It was on the steps of the south end of the Capitol, where a lot of press conferences are held. We were about 30 minutes into the press conference when there was a commotion, and we realized that one of the members had fallen, and it really wasn't clear who or really what was going on, or if he was okay. And so I think personally, I've not witnessed something like that. So it took me a second to kind of get my wits about me, but I clearly saw it as my job to stay there and observe what was happening. Well, it wasn't long. Just a couple of minutes into it, some of the staffers started telling the press to, they're kind of yelling not to take photos. I think it's important to note that from where a lot of us were standing on the bottom floor, that we couldn't really see we couldn't see the lawmaker who had fallen anyway. A lot of the lawmakers were standing around him at that point, there were a couple of photographers who were who had an elevated point of view and were shooting down. But what I would like to say is that what I saw were journalists doing their job, you know, and I think the important thing is not that they were taking photos. I mean, they have a split-second decision to take. I'm not a photographer, but they had a split-second decision to react in that moment, and their instinct is to document what's happening. You know, that's what we are. We're observers, we're documenters, you know, we're there to be an eyewitness to what's happening at the Capitol. And that's what I saw happening. And the other thing, it wasn't just that they were telling us not to take photos, they're also telling us to leave the area. And I know a lot of us were like, nah, that's not happening. Trying not to be confrontational and trying to be respectful of what was happening. But at the same time, you know, we didn't know what, you know, who it was, you know, if he was okay. So I think a lot of us just try to maintain a safe distance or respectful distance and just kind of watch what was happening. And I think to your question, and when you tell journalists not to do something, that's you know, not only are you making it difficult for us to do our job, but you're probably not going to get the reaction that you're desiring in that moment. So I think there was a little bit of defiance from some members of the media. But yeah, so a lot of us, you know, kind of try to keep a respectful distance, but we're there to do our jobs and observe and document. But I think it's also important not that the photos were taken, but also like what came of them. I haven't seen any of those photos published, and my understanding is that no one plans to publish the photos unless he ends up being seriously injured or worse. And my understanding is that he's okay. So you may never see those images.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective. Senator McLaurin, I believe you were also present. What do you think about the events of yesterday and the responsibility of legislators to respect, you know, members of the press who are doing their job in the Capitol?
Sure. Well, you know, I'll start with a point of agreement. I think one thing everybody on the call probably can agree about is that we should never hear the phrase 30 minutes into a press conference. You know, there is a real issue in terms of the amount of time that Democrats had scheduled. And I mean, even from a medical perspective, some members being able to stand that long. Right. So, you know, we had already sort of made our points. And I think everybody there kind of got what was going on when this happened. So, you know, I think obviously everybody's attention and would have turned to the medical incident anyway. But everybody's utmost concern immediately, you know, shifted from talking points in response to Kemp to the well-being of our colleague. And obviously it's, you know, easier to speak a little more freely about it this morning, given that we know that he's recovering and doing okay, thank God. But, you know, in the moment, there was a lot of confusion. And I think tensions were running high, you know, or emotions were running high because we didn't know what was going on. And there's the protectiveness, right, about colleagues. I mean, obviously we have a lot of concern, but there's also a sense of identity that's shared by the legislators. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying, you know, there's this sense that, hey, we're on a team because we're all standing here together on the steps with our badges on, doing our joint, you know, statements together. And so I think if I had to explain some of my colleagues' behavior in getting hostile with journalists, you know, they're feeling a lot of confusion and fear, and they're also identifying with the legislators as kind of a team that's trying to protect against other people, you know, interfering or you know, bearing down upon the situation. I don't necessarily think that's all positive, right? I mean, I want to go ahead and grant that you know, there's a sense in which I think legislators can think this is our office, this is where we work, this is kind of our place. And so, you know, we have the right to say to somebody, hey, don't interfere with what we're doing. But there's an irony to that, because we love, especially Democrats, love to invoke the phrase people's house. Whenever we're making our policy arguments, you know, look at all these protesters who have come down to the people's house. But the people are not just represented by legislators, they're also represented by the fourth estate, right, media. And so it matters. And I, you know, as an attorney also, don't just want to butter you guys up this morning. I promise I had these views yesterday too. But it's important, right, that we are able to share the space, to Jill's point. And there is a difference, albeit subtle, between legislators who are worried about their colleague pleading or asking media to do a certain thing out of respect, out of whatever, versus threatening, telling them you don't get to do this. As you know, it's kind of rich that Democrats tell anybody what to do in the state capitol anyway. But yeah, I mean, I think that we need to understand that there's a line between those two things, and ideally legislators would be a little better about respecting that line.
Chairwoman Cupid, you, like me, were not there yesterday, but you do frequently lead open meetings where members of the public and the press have an interest in observing your work, just like at the press conference yesterday. What's your perspective on the role of the press in these situations and in meetings that might be contentious for other reasons, or how do you draw that line?
Not that I have any recent examples of that. But certainly I think the senator and Jill did a good job of sharing the varied interests in that type of setting and why people may respond the way that they do. I think one thing that was shared is that there was some confusion in that incident, and sometimes it just takes a while to reset and think about all of the things that should be prioritized. And certainly, in a public setting, transparency is important. And also, if something is being elevated, such as the state of the state where the press is there, certainly there's a natural response to want to capture that entire event. I feel for parties on both sides, and I can understand the interest of both, sitting as an elected official, but also being one that has been very mindful of the interest in the public and what we do.
Thank you. All right, well, let's jump into some substantive topics. One topic of renewed relevance right now is the issue of transparency in the realm of public safety. In recent weeks, we've seen increased protests related to the police training facility slated to be built in Southeast Atlanta. And the public recently learned that officers were not wearing body cameras when they killed a protester that officials said shot a state trooper. In 2022, taking another angle on public safety, there were also a number of investigations from the state legislature, from Congress, and from the Department of Justice into Georgia's prisons, into understaffing and conditions there. So there's just a number of relevant issues this session that might pop up. Taking a particular transparency lens, Senator McLaurin, you've been involved in the investigation in some prisons. In your experience, has a lack of transparency played a part in the issues that are leading these investigations? And do you see areas for improvement in transparency in Georgia prisons or in public safety more generally?
Yeah, so big question, and worth asking. It's one of the topics I try to focus the most attention on. If I ever get a soapbox, like I'm in Sandy Springs or Dunwoody, and I'm like, I know y'all want to talk about GDOT. Let me talk to you about prisons for 2 seconds. But the idea, I think journalists are very well familiar with, probably could explain a lot better than I can, is sort of the trade-off between access and transparency, or kind of like the normal journalism function, right? I mean, there's all kinds of conversations at both the national level and I think privately more at the state level about the trade between sort of a more oppositional or adversarial journalist relationship, right, where you're covering, exposing, whistleblowing, whatever, versus access, the idea that you have personal relationships with the people who are doing things, making it happen. And you kind of have this agreement. Well, I'm not going to just blow you up over XYZ, or not everything you say is on the record. In fact, I was just discussing this yesterday, there's almost a norm in Georgia that a lot of journalists, and feel free to yell at me if I'm mischaracterizing this, but there is a norm that some journalists will say, we're kind of off the record because we know each other and we work together a lot, unless we opt in and say, yeah, now you're on the record. If the New York Times calls me and they say, you have a question, I better be very clear. I mean, we better write out a contract, for the next 10 seconds, what we're going to say. And so, the same principle applies, this whole access trade-off thing with, I think, public safety, Department of Corrections, because ultimately the practical problem with any of these agencies, state or local, is that there are legitimate public interests in shielding some information, that normally, I guess, in another context would be more available. For example, there might be an active investigation that involves not alerting potential defendants or witnesses, right? So body cam footage, in details about investigation in any criminal matter could theoretically, depending on circumstances, have the ability to compromise the ability of the agencies to do their work. Likewise, in the state of Georgia, we classify inmate files, so disciplinary records, medical records, things that are happening inside GDC prisons as state secrets. I mean, it sounds like some spy stuff, but the idea is basically that the state does have legally full discretion as to whether those files are classified or not. So it makes it very difficult for people, advocates, nonprofit organizations, legislators who want to do casework to follow up and say, hey, a family of this person who's incarcerated is complaining that they're not getting adequate medical treatment. We want to raise that issue. It's very difficult, even if the department wants to collaborate with us, to confirm or deny certain details for different reasons, right? HIPAA and all that's part of that for medical issues as well, right? So it's really tough to have an adversarial whistleblower relationship when A, it means you trade off with access, right? And B, you don't have a natural legal right to a lot of that stuff anyway. And so you're almost at the mercy of some of these agencies, if you're in my shoes, right, to try to get information, to be collaborative, to work on specific problems or even the global policy issues. So, I would say just as kind of a model or construct, that I'm trying to present instead of getting into a whole bunch of specifics with any of these topics, that's the thing I struggle with is, I just had a meeting with the new Department of Corrections Commissioner. He seems like he's postured or positioned to be a lot more open with the flow of information than the previous commissioner was, which I'm super grateful for, and I want to start on a good note. But what does he want? He wants instant trust, right? He wants me to sort of sing his praises and come on calls like this and say, I think he's going to do a great job. And the truth is, we'll see. We're going to try to work together and see how much collaboration we can do. But again, ultimately, I'm kind of at the mercy of his department when it comes to the flow of information that would help me do that job.
Chairwoman Cupid, what sort of public safety issues have y'all seen up in Cobb County in the last year? And what's your perspective on that balance of openness and privacy that Senator McLaurin was talking about?
Thanks for asking. We have increasing use of technology in public safety, and there have been questions that have followed from everything from body cameras to license plate readers and now to facial recognition about how we use information and how the public has access to that information. And so for us, it's been important to craft robust policy around how we'll use that technology to have some sense of balance and to also have the public's trust. Just recently, I was reviewing policy regarding our facial recognition system and concerns about it potentially being exploited. And so there is specific language in that policy about it not being used for general public use and constraining the use of that technology to certain instances, and not necessarily related to transparency, but getting to the trust issue and the reliance on that technology. We have stated in our policy that there has to be other evidence that indicates that someone is a party of interest, that there cannot be sole reliance on facial recognition. And so I think whenever we are introducing technology or policies that do tend to dive into areas that seem to cause questions of privacy, it's very important to have some strong policies around it and some checks and balances that can address not only the use, but even the potential abuse of that technology. And that's also in our policy as well.
Thank you. Jill, public safety was a topic of Governor Kemp's speech yesterday. How do you expect that to manifest in the legislative session this year?
Yeah, I did. His comment about us entering a new phase in the fight against crime really stood out to me in his speech. And I suspect that what that will look like will be tougher penalties, for offenses. And there's already been some other bills filed that are along those lines. So that's what I'm expecting, more and more resources for those efforts. But also wanted to go back to what Senator McLaurin was saying about access, and especially with covering the legislature. That was an adjustment for me when I first started, is realizing that a lot of the conversations probably are on background, especially if you want people to talk to you. That's partly a function of the legislature being exempt from the Open Meetings Act, in my opinion, so it's kind of, covering the legislature is mostly about those relationships that you build with the lawmakers and the lobbyists and everyone else at the Capitol. So it's a lot of just talking, trying to understand. It sometimes feels like gossiping, but that's what it is, and then when you need something, you get them on the record, so, and I have no problem, and I know my colleagues feel the same way, pressuring people to get on the record when they need to be.
Yeah, I had this later in my outline, but speaking of the legislature not subjecting itself to the Open Records Act and Open Meetings Act, which they subject Chairwoman Cupid to, but not themselves. A contrast I usually like to point out in these meetings. But Jill, what kind of effect do you think it would have on your job and what goes on at the Capitol if those restrictions were changed?
Oh gosh, that's even hard to imagine. That would, if we had access to communications, that would be very eye-opening. We would have a better insight into the players who are influencing legislation and influencing lawmakers. That would be a game changer. It'd be a completely different world for us. For now, it's a lot of, there are ways to know who's influencing what, but it just takes more work. And again, those relationships and kind of learning who the lobbyists are and, who's talking to whom. And so it's a lot of just being there and observing is how I think observing and relying on those relationships to understand what's going on. But if we had access to records that could really nail down the people behind the scenes who are influencing legislation and the laws dictating, the laws that Georgians have to live under, that would be amazing.
Yeah. And I just from a personal perspective, it would also make it more accessible to people who can't be at the Capitol every day and members of the public and can't observe those relationships, taking place because they have other things to do in their lives. Senator McLaurin, I'll put you on the hot seat on that one. We do seem to be kind of moving in the opposite direction, because was reporting at the beginning of the session of changes in the Senate rules to expand legislative privilege between and confidentiality of conversations between senators on the floor. What's your perspective on that rule change and also the way that records in the Capitol are shielded from public scrutiny?
Sure. So I'm going to go ahead and put my Democrat hat on squarely so that there's no confusion about, the propaganda you're about to hear. But I'll stay at 30,000 foot level. There have been members of the General Assembly or former members that have interacted more with the subpoena process in the last year or two than maybe in a typical year. And so I think there's this shockwave of fear and uncertainty among some legislators about what exactly in terms of their communication, specifically with third parties, right? People who are not necessarily inside the building, maybe they're national groups, national politicians that they're talking to about who knows what, right? And they're concerned that some of those documents or communications could get produced. And so, a lot of this stuff has to do with the fake electors, right? Just to put a finer point on it, the couple years ago and the ongoing criminal investigations into, what exactly that meant. So the majority, I think in both chambers, I know definitely in the Senate, put a new set of provisions in their rules package. And, each one of the provisions in isolation looks fairly innocuous, right? It's like, legislative activity includes anything that's legislative. And isn't that an obvious circular definition, And oh, by the way, sometimes legislative activity includes third-party communications because we have to consult experts to do our job, So they put these little sort of platitudes sounding bite-sized nuggets of the rules, but construed together, you can tell what they're trying to do. It's like too clever by half. You see this when practicing law quite a bit, which is, you're trying to make something out of nothing. They're trying to create this impression that really legislative activity and ultimately legislative privilege shields sort of everything that touches legislative work at all, right? That if I have a third-party communication that somehow, because that's tangentially connected to the legislative work I'm doing, that this nebulous concept, I guess, to some of legislative privilege can now somehow magically expand to protect all of that from disclosure in the face of a valid subpoena, that's authorized by a court, right? The answer to that's no, right? But none of that's going to work. And whether it's a good or a bad idea, right? And I tend to think it's a bad idea to try to expand legislative privilege in that way, because again, to the point we're all making, there's so much protection for what legislators do already from scrutiny. But the idea that you can, amend a rules package inside one of the chambers of the legislature rather than ask a court what legislative privilege is. I mean, it's like trying to tack a napkin with some scribble on it to, the 10 Commandments. I mean, the legal effect of trying to change the rules in that way is null. So it's really all kind of posturing. And I think, this is all part and parcel of the game. One of the things that's so frustrating, to Jill's point about you get to the Capitol and you try to figure out what's really happening, is it's really hard to determine sometimes the difference between what somebody's actually trying to do versus what they're just signaling they're doing, because they either want to tell their base, hey, look, I'm fighting for you at the Capitol, or they want to keep a promise to somebody that they would support something specific. But, a lot of times you have to do that calculus first when you decide how to fight something. Because if you really think that legislative privilege could get expanded and you think there's a real risk of that, you go to war because it's a substantive policy change. But if you realize what they're actually doing, which is just kind of this weak attempt at signaling, or making a litigation position slightly better than it would have been in their opinion, that may not be worth your effort because you realize they're just putting on a show, right?
Chairwoman Cupid, you operate in a very different world than legislators do, and I believe I can request your emails if I wanted to, and see your communications with almost everybody, pending, attorney-client privilege and things like that, but pretty limited exceptions. What impact does that have on your work?
It has always been a part of my work, so I just don't know any other context of how we operate. And we know that anything we put on paper, anything we put in email, any text that has substantive county matters in it is subject to public review. So it's just how we operate, and I can't perceive us operating under any other context.
Fair enough.
Sarah?
Yeah, Bill, go for it.
I just want to add something. My understanding is, lawmakers can voluntarily, provide, their documents, and so it's not like they have to keep these things secret. And I guess what struck me is that even though, with the argument, and the House did pass the same rule, and the argument they were making is like, this is already in the Constitution, blah, blah, blah. But to me, I thought it was really kind of setting a tone and sending a signal to people that, that this is secret, keep it to yourself, And so I just wanted to make the point that lawmakers can voluntarily be transparent.
Yes, you can. I believe you can waive any privilege that you have. So, yes. All right. I want to move on. Just we don't have too much more time. I'm going to try and cover elections and cannabis licensing in the next 10 to 15 minutes. So those are my goals. Let's talk about elections first. A perennial topic these days. I feel like every time we host this panel, elections come up, whether it's electoral reform or transparency around a recent election process. And this year's no different, as questions of transparency continue to make the news. Just this week, Fulton County Superior Court Judge Robert McBurney heard arguments about whether he's required to publicly release the report from the special grand jury looking into potential interference in the 2020 presidential election, for example. So far this session, GFAF is keeping an eye on House Bill 17, which adds some requirements and documentation concerning chain of custody of ballots. Jill, do you expect that we'll see any other bills, any further push for electoral reform this session?
I haven't really heard of anything other than the runoff, maybe ending or changing how we do runoffs. Which I haven't really heard much about that lately, so I have no idea. Maybe Senator McLaurin can can weigh in on that, the chances of that happening. And I think the HB 17, if that's something they've tried to do in the past and it's been controversial. Chairwoman Cupid can speak to the headaches that that might cause counties, which I think was really kind of the heart of the objection in the past. That's all I'm aware of right now.
Senator McLaurin, and I'll ask you about the runoff question and note that a recent AJC poll found that 58% of Georgians would support eliminating the runoff requirement. There had been a little bit of chatter in December about addressing some of those or opening up the Pandora's box of runoffs. Do you think we're likely to see any changes this year or any push for that?
I definitely do. There's a few indicators of that. I think one is you just know from experience, Republicans now know how good of an issue it is for them just because of the amount of pain that we all experienced during that extra few weeks. So they know that a lot of people, to your point about the poll, are likely to support. Second thing is I'm seeing the people who I know are organizing ranked choice voting and or some sort of runoff elimination. I'm seeing them walk around the Capitol. Again, back to this point that you're kind of figuring out who's doing what, where are they at any given time, and they're around, right? So I think they're cooking something up. And the last thing is, I don't know how much at liberty I am to talk about this, but I know that I can just say generally Democrats are mobilizing at a leadership level our response to those issues, right? So there's issues that we sort of released individual members to legislate, drop bills the way that they see fit, and then there's issues that are sort of the banner issues that typically leadership will either drop their own bill and then we all sign it, or they'll sort of preserve the messaging on that issue for their own province. And the RCV runoff stuff, I can tell you, is inside the leadership bubble, right? So to me, that signals that the parties are preparing for some kind of a epic clash at some point during the session on that. So I would expect it to come.
Thank you. Chairwoman Kiva, per Jill's point, if you have any perspective on additional requirements about chain of custody of ballots, but please let us know or share those. But I'd also like your take on when the legislature considers electoral reform, in your view, how important is it to build in transparency and public access measures into election laws?
Well, I'd like to add in before that it's important to even think about the practical impact of these measures and that they're real people having to apply these to a very heightened, stressful, significant process within our government, which is to run elections. And that certainly transparency is important because we want the trust of our citizens to know that votes are going to be properly counted, and anything that undermines that trust is a challenge for us. But I also know that we've had some procedural changes with the new elections law that have had significant impact on our county, particularly the compressed timeline between a general election and a runoff election, and considering the impact on workforce that we all are experiencing across every industry. We have not been immune to having challenges. So yes, I certainly believe transparency is extremely important when it comes to elections, but so is the practical impact of it to make sure that we can abide by all of the requirements so that we can have trust in our election process.
Sounds like a bit of a moving target. So to switch topics briefly to medical cannabis licensing, which is something that the First Amendment Foundation has been following a lot this year. In 2019, the legislature passed the HOPE Act, which allows the production and sale of cannabis oil in Georgia for the first time. And last year, the Georgia Access to Medical Cannabis Commission issued the first licenses to 6 private companies that will now be allowed to actually grow marijuana and distribute the oil in Georgia. As can often happen with government contracts like this, the companies that lost out on those opportunities have challenged the legitimacy of the bid process in court. But it has been essentially impossible for journalists and the public to figure out the truth about what's going on in that process, because the HOPE Act made almost every document that was submitted to or created by the Cannabis Commission exempt from Georgia's Open Records Act. And to make matters worse, the administrative court that handled the cases brought by those losing bidders on the cannabis licenses put the entire court file under seal, meaning that the public can't access any of those documents being filed there. The First Amendment Foundation has actually been working to get those files made public, but so far we haven't had a final ruling on that. Now, last year, legislators filed several bills that would have provided more public access to the commission, the Cannabis Commission's files, but those bills ultimately failed. Just yesterday, the commission formally issued its annual report for 2022, and that report included some proposed legislative changes to the HOPE Act that would improve transparency in their process. Senator McLaurin, what do you think? Do you expect there to be any political will to make the recommended changes to the HOPE Act? And separately, when a commission like this makes its own recommendations and its own report, in your experience, does the legislature generally follow those recommendations, or do you go your own way in solving whatever problems the commission identified, or does that just sort of get swept under the rug?
Oh boy, I'm trying not to get more cynical as I stay years longer into this job. But, you know, at the end of the day, there's a few basic realities that govern all this stuff, right? And I think, you know, to not to make this overly academic, but the point we were talking about earlier about access and leverage, right? I think if you boil down what's really happening with cannabis oil in terms of the power politics of it, you've got a wildly popular substance or drug or, you know, chemical that over the next few years, we're only going to move in the direction of more liberalization of access, right? Broad public support for having this type of access. It's really only an accident of history that the legislature is so gerrymandered that the elected Republicans who had to make that decision were less supportive on average than the public in terms of having this access, right? So given that the dam is going to break at some point, and there's going to be a lot of revenue, I would predict, in the next 10 to 20 years from some sort of legal cannabis regime that's put into place. What you've got is pressure to liberalize, and you've got a lot of money in liberalizing. And so just the crack in the dam that bill allowed, and that was one of the first votes I took because I arrived in 2019, and Republicans were barely squeaking it through again, right? And that context is relevant because it means that it was not as wide of a liberalization even as the public would have supported by that point, right? So it's just this little crack. So what does that mean? It means that inevitably the government now is in charge of distributing free money, right? I mean, I think boiling it down that way is helpful because then you can understand why you have so many access problems on the back end with transparency. Because again, that leverage, that balance is off. You don't have the ability or the political will to do much more liberalization. And so the amount of access that's there, the government can carefully control. It's early and I've had one cup of coffee. Hopefully I'm not being completely incoherent. But I think based on those dynamics, even Democrats, elected Democrats, were trying to figure out how this process was going to work. We had maybe one little piece of leverage over the bill, and that was minority representation. That was part of what the Democratic caucuses added, was to say, look, we know that you've got a lot of super conservative social types in your majority, so you're going to need Democratic support to get this across the line. What we would ask of you is that you ensure some basic protections in the licensing process. But even that was an enormous struggle. It took all the capital the Democratic caucuses brought to bear to try to get tweaks to the way that access would be distributed, right? So given how centralized that power was and how potent it was, I don't think that there's going to be any real political will by the legislature. Kind of answer your second question, a commission wrote a report, that's nice, right? At the end of the day, there's a handful of personalities that make all these decisions. I joke there's like 5 to 10 people who run the whole state ultimately. And unless those people have like a solid grounded power politics reason why it's in their interest or why they're compelled to show up with a certain level of transparency, they simply will not.
Jill, I'll just get your take on that. What do you think?
Well, I'll just add that I think we did see a little bit of progress yesterday with the commission passing some rules dealing with distribution and kind of the details of how the program will run. I think that takes probably a little pressure off lawmakers, which is kind of the fuel, I think, behind a lot of the changes we see under the Gold Dome. So, that tells me that there's a chance we probably won't see much, just because of that there's just a little bit of that release valve there. But I've also heard that Alan Powell plans to pursue some kind of legislation. So we might see something, but I do think the fact that, that was considered a milestone for the commission to pass those rules. So, and then it kind of lays the groundwork for some of these dispensaries to start opening this year. That's a big deal. So that does take some of the pressure off lawmakers, I think.
I'll say from my perspective, it seems that having these, contract bidding processes shrouded in secrecy and making it hard for journalists to figure out what actually happened lets other folks in that vacuum, toss out allegations of corruption that nobody can really test and figure out what happened. And Chairwoman Cupid, I wonder, if your experience in Cobb, what does it do to the public trust in government when you don't have these transparencies around these kind of contract award processes? Or, conversely, what does it do to boost public trust when you do have that kind of transparency? What's your experience there?
Yeah, I think your question has the answer. And certainly, the more transparency there is, the more opportunity there is to build trust. And I know there have been a lot of citizens who've had a lot of interest in getting into this industry and saw this as an opportunity, not just for our state, but for them to be a part of this growing industry here in our nation and our state. And so there is a lot of disappointment about the level of selectivity and the lack of opportunity to learn more about how they can play a part. And then just looking at things from a consumer base, I don't have the ability to share the fullness of disappointment that those who are waiting, for access, for particularly people who have serious medical conditions or children, the level of frustration that they've had with how this has moved forward. But certainly at the end of the day, I think the lack of transparency is just causing a general distrust, particularly amongst those that thought that they would have the ability to be a part of this prosperous industry, or perceived prosperous industry for our state.
I appreciate you bringing that back around to the patient perspective, because I think that's important to not lose that in this conversation. So we are about out of time. I don't see any questions in the chat. So if anybody has any closing thoughts as we wrap up, and what you expect in the legislative session or just on the agenda for the next year, would love to hear them. Jill, why don't we start with you?
We'll just say it's still very early in the session. It's off to a very slow start because of all the leadership changes. So there's still plenty of time for mischief. We're there looking for it.
Thank you for your work. Chairwoman Cupid, any closing thoughts?
No, we're always interested in what's going to happen at the state and what the resulting impact will be on the counties. And certainly as laws move forward, we consider ourselves to be where the rubber meets the road, and know that that's going to have a practical impact on how we operate. So we'll be paying close attention. Something that wasn't discussed today was even just the redistricting and cityhood, and just the amount of impact that's had on Cobb County. I know perhaps somewhat akin to transparency is just notice. And with our cityhood efforts, we've had a lot of citizens who just were not aware that they were being pulled into this area. So we'll be leaning on our counterparts to look at how we can make this more transparent process for citizens that could be impacted through something that could result in them being put in a new jurisdiction and resultantly having higher taxes because of it.
Yeah, thank you for getting that in there at the end. I appreciate that. Senator McLaurin, any closing thoughts from you?
Sure. I totally agree with Jill. It's early and mischief abounds, and will certainly come find us. I think that this is one of the most interesting moments in Georgia politics that we've had for a minute. I mean, I say that in the sense that the die was pretty cast after Trump, right? It was like, my Republicans didn't really want to affiliate with Trump, but they did their best to sort of appease the base, and Democrats were like, we hate Trump, and that's going to animate years of our politics, right? But we're in this weird sort of new moment now where Brian Kemp is extremely popular, right? As far as politicians go, he's got a lot of momentum, but he's in a swing state, right? I mean, he's in a state where Democrats won the last 3 U.S. Senate elections. That's a big deal. Democratic caucuses have a lot of new energy. Both chambers, you've got younger people with different backgrounds, a lot of diversity, and the new Democrats who are joining the Gold Dome or going to work there. And you've got Republicans who are looking for kind of a new identity post-Trump. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting opportunity for collaboration and for, new recasting of party identities and priorities. But again, back to that point about class solidarity or whatever, it'll be interesting to see how those opportunities for Democrats and Republicans translate to open access and the ability of journalists to get information. Because, in some ways, the friendlier that the teams are playing against each other, the worse it may be for access, because it creates the potential that we collaborate as lawmakers to sort of, us versus them, right? So I actually really appreciate, I love being part of this panel, and thank you, because it is a really interesting opportunity to reflect on, what are the ways in which we need to be more conscious as legislators about our relationship with access to information, and maybe put aside some of our instincts to circle the wagons, right?
Well, thank you all for being here and sharing your time this morning. That was a very interesting conversation. And again, want to thank the First Amendment Foundation sponsors for supporting our mission throughout the year. I'll pass things over to Julia Boyd, who's the Executive Director of the Atlanta Press Club, for our next panel. And thank you everybody so much for your time.
Thank you, Sarah.
And thanks for that great first panel. And again, thanks to everybody for joining us today for this virtual legislative breakfast and reporters roundtable. And thank you to our friends at the Georgia First Amendment Foundation for partnering with us on this event. The Atlanta Press Club's mission is to serve the evolving professional and educational and social needs of our media community, foster journalistic excellence, and advance the public's interest in and understanding of a free press. And programs like this help us to continue to work towards our mission. So we sincerely appreciate all of our panelists and attendees today. For more information about membership, upcoming events, or the work that APC does, please visit atlantapressclub.org. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our panel for today. Our moderator is Donna Lowry, Capitol correspondent and host of Georgia Public Broadcasting's Newsmakers. Next, we have Richard Elliott, reporter for WSB, Sam Greenglass, politics reporter at WABE, and Maya Prabhu, government reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. As a reminder, you can enter any questions in the chat for the end of the program. And Donna, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Julia. I'm excited to get started. I've a very interesting first panel, a lot of great things that they talked about. And so I'm excited about this group too, because I see them every day at the Capitol. They're hardworking, and we have a lot of things to talk about. So let's get started. It's day 8 of the 40 days. And as the previous panel mentioned, it is moving slow. A lot of that, part of that, pomp and circumstance surrounding the new governor coming in, the governor's second term, I should say, and the state of the state. And that little thing called a big football game that took place early on kind of moved things a little slower. Plus, we have 53 new people who are legislators this year. So that has everybody's kind of getting to know each other because there's new leadership in both chambers. So given that, let's talk about some of the things that we may hear during this session. And a lot of that, of course, is coming out of the governor's office because he's the veteran, in a sense, in leadership when it down there at the Gold Dome. So let's start with an issue that has received a lot of talk right now, and that is housing. And this is housing that we can also tie to another issue, which is big, and that is the workforce issue. So there's housing in terms of workforce issues and the new companies that are coming into Georgia, but then also housing in terms of just affordable housing. So that the Democrats would kind of lean in that direction. And so, Richard, let's start with you on those issues in terms of what we're hearing about what the lawmakers may deal with when it comes to housing in the state and the crisis that some call it.
Well, what we've heard from the governor is all about bringing business to Georgia is kind of something that a lot of people think about. They want to live close to work, and he would like to see more what he calls workforce housing, some kind of alignment with local governments and with corporations to try and make communities closer to where people work or where these big industries are. I think his big problem is, or his obstacle is within living memory. Some people remember old mill towns, and that didn't quite work so well. In fact, when I first moved back to Atlanta and got married, I lived in Cabbagetown, which was a mill town for the old Fulton Cotton and Bag Mill. The Democrats are talking about what they call continuing housing. And one of their big issues that they would like to tackle is this issue of corporations coming in and buying all these houses all over the state of Georgia. They think it's driving up prices, and it's making it harder for people to buy homes. So those are two big issues, I think, that both sides would like to work at, and there may be some common ground between them.
Yeah, and I would argue there may be a third one, and Maya, I'm going to turn to you on this, and that is what you guys at the AJC have focused on, and that is the dangerous type housing that's out there, and that there is an interest in making sure something. I think your people call it dangerous dwellings, right? Really great reporting on that, about where people are living currently that is just horrible places to live and to bring up kids coming out of these homes, and where the landlords, slumlords, and those kinds of people are making it difficult for kids to go to school after living in really horrible conditions. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, as someone who started my professional career, my adult life, I guess I would say after graduate school in Maryland, coming to the South was a wake-up call for me, because we have a lot of tenant protections and regulations of what constitutes an apartment, and the requirements of what has to be in an apartment, smoke detectors, things like that have to be in apartments. And we don't have a lot of that type of oversight here in Georgia. And so, this lack of protections for tenants is something that is definitely motivating for Georgia residents. We had a poll earlier this week, and that, of all of our questions on the poll, and we tackled a wide range of issues, that was the one that had the most consensus. I think it was close to 90% of folks who responded to the poll say that the state needs to implement stronger tenant protections. So, I think the sad part of that is, and to quote Senator McLaurin from earlier, maybe the longer we're down there, the more cynical we become. But I don't know that we'll see any movement on anything that would make apartments safer, or institute more types of rules or regulations about what constitutes an apartment. So, maybe I'll be surprised every now and then I am, but I'm not expecting to see any of that kind of legislation out of the Capitol this year.
Yeah, Sam, what do you think? I know that there's still a lot of talk about just the fact that what Richard was talking about, these people who come in, buy up these huge tracts of land, and then make it people to even buy housing. So the American dream is it's stifled by all of that. But so I kind of get the feeling that we may see something that deals with that, and in addition to the workforce issues.
It's interesting. I think from the very beginning of this session starting, I'm thinking back to the eggs and issues breakfast that happens every year. You heard so many lawmakers and top officials talking about workforce housing. And it's not something that we've really heard in the last year under the Gold Dome. I think the only housing topic that really came up last session was efforts to criminalize homeless encampments. So it's really striking to see so many people really focused on this issue. But as Jill Nolan pointed out in the last panel, it's been kind of a slow start to this session. So there's still a lot of questions exactly what form this is going to take. my colleague Raul has heard a lot of what you just mentioned, these efforts to deal with corporate owned housing developments that are buying up properties and then renting them out. We heard some lawmakers bring this up during budget week last week, asking, officials presenting the budget to address this. So whether that comes up, whether it's, Governor Kemp has talked about this rural workforce housing fund, that's one other form that this could take. And, my colleague Stephanie Stokes, who covers housing for WABE, pointed out that so much of what is spent on housing is typically from the federal government in terms of tax breaks and grants. And so it's quite interesting to see this moment where Governor Kemp is proposing state dollars to, put money into housing. What form that takes, is it specifically for, local governments in near projects like Rivian to add housing specifically for workers coming to these new economic development projects? That's one thing that we're gonna have to see how it unspools over the course of this session.
Yeah, I think what we might see, and I've heard some talk about some zoning changes or trying to figure out how to do that delicate dance of working with local communities when it comes to zoning issues. And that is really tough at the state level to try to tell the locals how to handle those kinds of issues. But I have heard talk that there may be some things dealing with that. And when we talk about workforce issues, the other thing that came out really big and the budget hearings from just about every agency is just getting workers into jobs. We've seen a lot of turnover. It was surprising to hear some of the agencies that have lost so many people. Attorney General Chris Carr talking about all the attorneys that have left. So a lot of the agencies are having a hard time filling those slots. Richard, talk about that a little bit and some of what you've heard.
It's always funny to me when state officials tout how low the unemployment rate is in the state of Georgia. A very, very low unemployment rate isn't always a great thing because it means there's worker shortages. And the state of Georgia is facing the same kind of worker shortages every other business and corporation is facing in the state of Georgia. So, Kemp is talking about raising state employee pay, trying to go out and recruit more people. It's a difficult, it's a hard sell sometimes because you get people who say, well, wait, the state official is making how much money? And at the same time, you got to pay these people money to get the talent that you want for the state government. You'll see an effort, and I think it'll probably be successful to increase pay for state employees. Obviously, it's going to go for teachers. But I think that kind of push will be successful. And he's tying education into recruiting more people too, not just state government, but to Georgia too, talking about, I think he used the line, I wrote this down, growing a generation of highly skilled workers, expanding the workforce pipeline. So, basically using the public education system to make better employees, to attract more businesses to come to Georgia.
Yeah, and the reality is, if you don't have a good education system, you're not going to have the people for the jobs that the state is bringing in. And so that education piece is an important part of all of this.
Yes, definitely. And, the folks of my generation, like I am an elder millennial, I think they call me, it was very much pushed upon us, this idea of go to college, get a degree, go into massive debt like I am, and, go out into the workforce. And, we're seeing more and more, there've been lots of discussions, but I don't know that there's been a lot of pen to paper, rubber meeting the road as far as this push toward getting more kids into learning trades that are usually well-paying jobs, but for whatever reason, as a culture in this country, we associate higher education with, bachelor's and master's degrees and how that's going to help us make more money and pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. But that doesn't seem to always be the case, especially folks who go into jobs like journalism and even folks with degrees who are going into social work. You think about folks at DFACs, their entry-level pay is so low, and these are all college educated people. So it's difficult. And I know people always say you can't just throw money at things. It's not, you can't just increase salaries, but people need to also be able to afford to live. And like we were just saying, housing is going up, we have inflation, it's expensive to just live anywhere. So yeah, we'll see what happens as far as this push toward more trade organizations getting training in that area. And I think, you know, if we're able to get that flowing, get kids into the system and creating that pipeline, like the governor said, maybe we'll see some changes there.
Yeah, so one of the areas we're hearing about is the you know, fully making sure the Hope scholarships and Hope grants are fully funded back to the early 90s. Some of us remember when things first started with the Hope scholarship. And so having that happen again, you know, so that just about anybody can have full tuition paid for in Georgia colleges. And I remember the early years of this, the reason was to prevent the brain drain for people who were in college in Georgia, going to, you know, staying here after college or going to college in Georgia, period, and not going somewhere else to college. So I think that'll help with things. But Sam, let's talk about that, but also this whole idea that some of these companies that are coming in won't necessarily need college graduates, but definitely technical school graduates, and that the K-12 education system needs to be shored up in order to be able to provide the type of jobs that are coming in with, you know, Q-Cells and Rivian and those kinds of places that are coming into the state.
Well, I think if you think back to when the Rivian project was announced last year, one piece of that economic deal, if I remember correctly, was a training center specifically to train workers for these high-tech battery-related jobs. And that is something that we saw trickle into the budget proposal this year. You bring up K through 12. There's Governor Kemp in his State of the State yesterday talked about fully funding QBE, but we heard from Democrats in their response that they don't think that is enough for restoring funding for K through 12. And also there's talks of trying to change the formula to include weights for low-income schools that serve high populations of kids in poverty. Georgia is one of just a few states that does not weight that in their funding formula. I want to go back to higher ed just for a moment. As a younger millennial who's, you know, not been so far out of college, you know, one thing that struck me from Chancellor Sonny Perdue's address during budget week was that enrollment is actually declining across the University of Georgia system. And he ascribed that in part to Georgia students deciding to go to colleges out of state and not staying here in Georgia. I think he noted that only 6 of the 26 schools in the system are making money right now, and that's going to result in cuts at some of these colleges. So it's interesting to, like, as you peel back some of these top line, we have this surplus. This is a really exciting moment for Georgia, funding all of these priorities. If you look under the covers a little bit at some of these budget talks, there are still some funding challenges that organizations are facing. And just to put a little comparison on this, though, I'm from Michigan. I went to our big state school, the University of Michigan, and there's not a program like the Hope Scholarship. And, you know, I watched Governor Whitmer's State of the State address just last night. It's sometimes interesting to see how different governors are talking about some of the same issues in different states with different party controls under the State House. And this is something she was talking about too. You know, how do we retain talent to stay here in the state? One other quick thing that I'll note, it'll be interesting to see how much some of these new social issues that were passed in the last couple sessions affect whether people want to stay in the state of Georgia. I'm thinking about the restrictive abortion rule, for example. How does that play into whether young people want to go to school and, you know, dig in roots here in the state of Georgia? I think it's too soon to say, but it'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, that's very much so. Richard, did you want to add something on all of this? Yeah, okay.
No, I'm just agreeing with everybody.
Yeah.
I think at this point I need to say I'm either a young boomer or an old Gen Xer, just to throw that out there too.
I was going to kind of say that too. So yeah, I'll put that in there. I'm kind of in with you on that a little bit. So yeah, so the education. So we're going to see something with education, if nothing more than what the governor has already announced in terms of increase $2,000 salary increases for teachers. There's the criticism that isn't for everybody in education. And there are a lot of people who work within the education system who aren't teachers, trying to bring more paraprofessionals into teaching because of the burnout and the teachers who are leaving the profession, all of that. And then what's happening at in the higher education system with the Hope Scholarship and all. So Richard?
And let me add one thing, that they're having trouble retaining teachers. I think even Governor Kemp mentioned they're having trouble retaining younger teachers. And some of that they're giving the pay raise, but also some of it is the law that was passed last year. And now I suddenly can't remember the name of it, the one where teachers can't teach certain things. They have to teach certain things in certain ways. And teacher organizations, GAE, were warning them, this is going to drive teachers away. And I don't know, I mean, we have no empirical data, but that has to be part of this conversation too.
Yeah, I think we do have to talk about it. Last year and so far, as we keep saying, it's been a slow session, but the culture wars, first of all, last year was an election year, let's face it. So there was a lot of red meat issues out there that each side actually was putting out there. So that makes things a whole lot different than where we are right now. But I think the focus on the culture wars was so heavy that after the session ended, people were like, whoa, there are a lot of other issues in education that we needed to focus on that we didn't hear about. And now it's sort of a catch-up period, in a sense, Maya, don't you think, to try to get to making sure that the education system is where it needs to be this year, because we just didn't see a whole lot of that last year. There was the pay raise, right? The down payment on the $5,000 so that Governor Kemp promised early on, but not a whole lot more other than the culture war stuff, CRT, obscene books, things like that.
Yeah, and not to point out, my generation again, but, I think there is a disconnect between, some folks who are, in their later 40s and 50s who have this idea of you get a job, you work, you stay there, you have this loyalty to the company, you get your pension, which don't exist for millennials anymore, and you just stay. And, we heard this during the budget hearings, department heads complaining that younger workers don't have a sense of loyalty to the company. Well, no, if I can't pay my rent, I'm not going to be loyal to you and stay here, right? So I think that's the idea with this teacher shortage, right? These younger teachers are not making the money that they would like to be making, probably have college debt, and they're going to move on. And to Richard's point, the divisive concepts, yes, the divisive concepts issue, would also make, that type of legislation typically is more favorable, again, among older people. Younger people are less inclined to like this idea of being told what they can and can't teach. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely going to make things difficult to keep younger teachers in the profession. And I feel like, election years sometimes are like a fever dream, and you come out and you're like, okay, what happened and what do we have to do now? And I feel like that's probably part of why this session is starting out so slowly. It's kind of like, okay, how much of a mess did we make? Did we make a mess? How can we clean it up? What do we have to do to get things on track and governing now versus campaigning?
Yeah, I love that phrase, fever dream. I'm going to have to, yeah, that really describes it really well. Sam, jump in on this.
I think just looking at the session broadly, I think you both are exactly right that the tone and the types of legislation that is coming up, at least so far, is totally different than last session. Was my first session covering the legislature. And from the beginning, it was this immediate onslaught of bill after bill after bill, divisive concepts, obscene materials, trans kids in school sports, loosening gun restrictions, all of these social issues that were extremely divisive around the Capitol and translated right onto the primary campaign trail. You know, if we think back, it's hard to remember that we went through all this, but Governor Kemp was facing a primary challenge from former US Senator David Perdue as we were beginning the session. None of that exists now. You know, Kemp has tons of political capital. He's got these high approval ratings, and so much more of the focus is on these kitchen table issues, you know, schools, taxes, and there is not this fire around the Capitol in this moment, at least it seems at this time, as there was last session. And it'll be interesting, is that a reflection of Governor Kemp's second term, or is that just this particular moment when we are not in an election year?
Yeah, not in an election year, new leaders, new people at the Capitol, the diversity, all of those kinds of things, I think will factor into what type of session we'll have. And those of us who've covered the sessions for years can remember the times when we came in and there were budget crises, and there isn't one now. There's a surplus. And so it's different in so many ways than previous sessions. I want to stick with you, Sam, because I want to talk a lot about, because we're talking about the election year of last year. And one of the issues that will come up or is expected to come up is something dealing with the elections, especially when it comes to runoffs, because there's just voter fatigue when it comes to just voting period. But then these runoffs made it more difficult. So I know you've done some reporting along those lines. Talk about that a little bit.
I mean, something that we heard from election officials, in the period between the general election and the runoff and in the days afterwards, was that it was really hard to turn around and prepare for an election with only 4 weeks because you're still finishing certifying the last election, basically, while you're also having to get your ducks in a row to do this next one and do it again. And so that's one thing that we heard come up, in addition to this election fatigue that you mentioned from voters who are like, oh my gosh, how many times have we done this already? I think Warnock talked on the campaign trail about this was his 5th race within 2 years. That's a lot for voters, for candidates, for everyone. So one signal that we first heard that there might actually be movement to do something on this front is from Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who after the December runoff said, I'd like to see changes. He didn't prescribe a change exactly, but he did say like, hey, I would like the legislature to do something about this. And there's basically a couple of different routes that they could take. One would be to get rid of that 50+% threshold altogether, to just scrap the runoff. Another would be to lower that threshold. I believe it used to be 45%, correct me if I'm wrong, before some changes were made. There used to be a lower threshold. One option would be to pull it back down. And another that's been floated that might be a higher hill to climb would be something called ranked choice voting, which is already done in Georgia for overseas and military ballots. But opponents say this would be really confusing, hard to educate voters, and that would eliminate the need for a second runoff election date altogether. I don't think we've actually seen bill proposals yet, so I don't know what form this is going to take this year, but there's certainly interest in different corners of the Capitol to make some changes here.
And Maya, I know you're in the Senate a lot. Are you hearing anything over there?
We had interview with the lieutenant governor who said recently he's not in favor of this idea of ranked choice voting. I think there is an idea that something needs to be done, but like Sam said, we don't know what that looks like. And again, as someone who's like lived and worked and voted as an adult in other states, in Maryland, it is whoever gets the most votes wins. You don't have to get 50%. And so when I moved, I was in South Carolina before I was here. And when I moved, and this whole idea of 50% and a runoff was so confusing to me. I was like, what do you mean the person who gets the most votes should win? I don't get it, right? And then the other thing is, in South Carolina, all runoffs were 4 weeks, right? Granted, Georgia's a much larger state than South Carolina is, and it might be more difficult for election workers here to turn around election in 4 weeks as it was for folks in South Carolina. So it's interesting to hear these ideas coming here, when that was just kind of I mean, when I was floored when I moved to South Carolina, and I was like, I thought everyone just was the most, whoever got the most votes wins. That makes sense to me. So, you know, just seeing these ideas be discussed here, it's interesting to see how that will come to play. You know, our elections voting guru, Mark Nisi, at the paper, you know, I think, you know, we don't have any, we've seen no bills, we have no reason to believe this, but like when we look in our crystal ball, you know, we think maybe they'll extend it from 4 weeks to maybe 5 or 6 weeks, not go back to the full, what was it, 9 that we had before, but you know, just to give in some more time for election workers to turn things over for a runoff. I mean, you know, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, election boards are feeling a lot of the pressure on this. You know, you mentioned South Carolina with Georgia being bigger. Not only is that, but we have so many counties, so we have so many election boards, and so there's a lot. So Richard, jump in on this and with your thoughts.
I kind of look at this the way I also look at gambling in Georgia. There's so many different options. They can't decide on one, so they won't decide on any, which is kind of where I'm feeling right now. Everyone says we need to do something. Lawmakers say we need to do something, but I don't think they're anywhere close to deciding. And one of the big reasons is they don't know how it will affect them. I've been at the Capitol just long enough to, as Senator McLaurin said, get a little cynical, and every bill, something is factored into every vote. How will it affect me and my reelection chances? And I don't think they want to start tinkering with anything until they absolutely know how it will or will not affect their next race. So I think there'll be a lot of talk about it. I think that, like Maya said, as Mark Nisi said, if we get something, it'll be extending it. I think there was enough complaining from respected elections people like Eveler in Cobb County, going on camera saying this is not enough time to turn this around. If something happens, I would expect to see a longer time between the general and the runoff, but I don't know that they're going to get rid of anything or make any other big changes to it, at least not yet. And remember, some of the big players in making those changes are no longer big players, especially in the House. So I don't think there'll be quite as much impetus on that, especially with other things going on.
Yeah, or they're gone. You know, the players are gone. So you talked about gambling in this. So let's talk about gambling a little bit. And Maya, you're in the Senate a lot, so that's why I wanted to talk to you about. You know, the Senate has been considered the chamber that has not been as receptive to anything when it comes to gambling. But there is a feeling that sports betting might move this year. So talk about that.
So again, cynicism is heavy for me. You know, this is my 6th legislative session. I think they've only been pushing particularly sports betting since 2020, after the 2019 Supreme Court ruling. But every session I've been has been, this is the session gambling is going to pass, right? Before sports betting, it was horse racing, it was casinos. Everybody thought that sports betting would be an easier lift. And I think they were surprised last year when it didn't even make it to the floor of the House. You know, the Senate is typically the more conservative chamber, but the Senate voted sports betting out of the chamber last year. And then it went over to the House and just kind of languished. So I think the fight will continue to be who gets the money, how it gets divvied up, you know, the revenue that's generated from taxes and licensing fees and what have you. And if they're not, you know, depending upon who you ask, you need a constitutional amendment, right? So this is the big question these days. If you need a constitutional amendment, you need 2/3 of each chamber to support it. If you want 2/3 of each chamber to support it, you need Democratic buy-in. And so that's where the rub is going to be. Like there are conservative Republicans who are not going to vote for any type of gambling. So even if they had every Republican, they still need Democratic support. And so that is where Democrats get to flex their muscles a little bit. Like, hey, you need us. What are we going to get from this, from going along with you? So I don't know. Like, everybody says this is the year it's going to pass. I don't know. Come back to me at the end of session on Sine Die. We'll see what happens. I don't have hopes of it making it, but I'm just completely cynical at this point.
Yeah, it would be interesting to have this conversation after Sine Die. Sam?
I don't have too much to add besides something that I found kind of fun that I learned when I started looking up gambling law in Georgia, which is that beside the lottery, the other two forms of gambling that you are allowed to do is raffles and bingo. Bingo is also allowed. So that I felt like was a fun fact when I started looking into gambling. That's all I got.
That's true. And there's a lot of bingo going on. I seem to hear about it all the time. Actually, I'm going to something bingo in a few months that you actually at the end of it, you get a nice designer purse. So it's yeah, it's kind of a different, you know, what you don't get the money, but you get a designer purse.
Send me an invitation. I want to.
It's I've actually been before and it's kind of fun. I didn't win, but you know, it was fun. Richard?
Yeah, and Maya is exactly right. Every year for the past couple of years, it's like, well, this is the year gambling is going to pass. This is the year, and then it never happens. I think last year, and Maya, you may be able to help me with this, and Sam too. Part of the reason it failed in the House is because they couldn't get Democratic support, because Democrats were flexing their muscles and they wanted things, and the Republicans were not willing to give them some of the things that they wanted. That's one of the reasons why it died. I think the fact that Harold Melton, the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, came out and said, you know what, you don't need a constitutional amendment, gives a big boost to that effort. And the new version of it, I guess, puts it all under the lottery and all the money going to Hope, and all this this focus now from the governor on education, fully funding Hope. I think sports betting has got a better chance this year. I'm like Maya asked me at the end of the session, because every year I think something might happen and then nothing happens. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think one of the things with sports betting, Maya, has to do with the fact that it has grown in the recent years and that we know people are doing it and that the money is not coming into Georgia. Right.
Yeah, and I think something that I found interesting in our recent AJC poll is that the last time we asked the question, like, do you think sports betting should be, you know, legal in Georgia? I think it was something like 57 or 58% said they did. This time around, only 49% people said they did. And so you would think that with all of the advertisements by FanDuel and all of the companies that do allow, you know, that have sports betting platforms, you would think that support would grow. So it's interesting that I don't know if it's fatigue. I know I'm fatigued. I don't know if it's fatigue over the sports betting issue or what, but you know, the argument, like you said, Donna, is that it's happening anyway. You know, depending upon who you ask, it's like, you know, $5 billion or $1 zillion. I don't know, like depending upon who you ask is how much money is being spent by Georgians in sports betting. And they say that revenue will help bolster Hope or rural broadband or healthcare or needs-based scholarship. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, that I think we'll just have to see. It's interesting that the sports teams of in Georgia have all supported this too. The major sports teams. I know we're running a little late and we got a couple of questions, so I just want to put these out to you guys while we have a few moments here. So one of them is from Jeannie, I think it's Jean Dubert. Housing, planting large scales, heavy industry in rural areas like the proposed Rivian factory without an assessment of the impact on housing for roads and other infrastructure exacerbates the existing gap between available housing and what the local employment base can afford. In Morgan County, the median home price has doubled in the last 4 years to $600,000. What tools can be deployed that respect local zoning and address the problem? Anybody want to take that one?
I mean, that's kind of the state working with the corporation that's coming in. I mean, if we are, I hate to use this phrase, making mill towns, you know, the corporation is going to have to take some responsibility, and then the local governments have to come in too. And I know local governments, county commissions, and the state government are not on the best of terms right now after redistricting. There's been a lot of angry words back and forth. I don't know if Chairwoman Cupid is still here, but you know, there's feathers have been ruffled. So some things are going to have to be smoothed over between the state, county commissions, and then bringing these corporate partners in to try and come up with some kind of way to make this work.
Yeah, I do think it's a delicate balance of whatever they're gonna do at the state level to what, you know, the county levels, the local levels, municipalities will have to do. So we'll have to see what happens with that one. And that may be one of the another one of the things that we see slowly reveal itself during this session. We'll see about that. The other question from Dean Annison regarding elections reform, I wonder if primaries are where the efforts could be focused. Has anyone proposed getting rid of them and creating more open choice and competition in general elections? Has anybody heard about that? Any of you? Yeah.
The
Sam,
only
I know
time-
you've done election stuff. Go ahead.
The only time I've heard something about this was in 2017, which was my first year here. We had special elections, and you know, the term jungle primary gets thrown out there, right? In these special elections when everybody runs on one ballot. And it was a Senate seat that Jen Jordan ended up winning, but there were, memory is failing me, but maybe like 8 or 9 candidates in there, you know, half Republicans, half Democrats. The person who previously sat in that seat was a Republican, and then 2 Democrats are the ones who made it to the runoff. And so right in that, you know, a lot of election reform policy ideas come when something they don't like happens. So there was this question of like, do we need to have, not getting rid of primaries, but they were saying that in special elections, we should have primaries. They were bringing more primaries in. So the opposite of what the question was, this idea that they should have primaries so that we can ensure that a Republican and a Democrat are, the 2 parties are represented, you know, before it, you know, the person is selected. That's the only thing I've heard regarding changing the primary structure. Because even this idea of you know, ranked choice or longer periods for runoffs, or, you know, dropping the threshold to 45%, those only apply to general election. The ideas, we haven't seen a bill yet, but the ideas have said it's only going to apply to general elections, not primary. So I haven't seen much of a desire to change the way the primary structure is set up. I don't know, Sam.
I mean, I haven't either, but one thing that's interesting to remember is that in Georgia, you don't have to be registered to one party or another to vote in the primary, like in some states. You do have to pick one ballot or the other, but something that we saw last spring was some Democrats or independents voting in the Republican primary because either they wanted to make sure that Perdue did not get nominated, or they wanted him to be nominated, thinking he might be an easier opponent for Stacey Abrams to vanquish. You know, same thing went in other races where, you know, people from various parties were trying to swish the results in one way or another. So that's one factor that happens in Georgia primaries that doesn't necessarily happen everywhere else.
Yeah. Richard, any final thought?
I remember that. I remember way back in the day, you probably remember Cynthia McKinney.
Yes.
She lost her race because there was a lot of Republican crossover voting in DeKalb County at that time.
Yeah, we've seen it happen. We certainly have. Well, that wraps up what we're talking about. You guys are great. I knew you would be. I love working with you at the Capitol, and that's fun doing it for this session right here. So I'll turn it back over to Julia Boyd.
Thank you, Donna. And oh, I just went off camera. There we go. Thank you, Donna and Sam and Richard and Maya. What a fantastic conversation. I know that we all enjoyed it. And again, thank you to our previous panel and the Georgia First Amendment Foundation. This recording will go up live on the Atlanta Press Club and the Georgia First Amendment Foundation website. So please check back for the recording if you are interested. And thanks again for attending today. Have a great one.